Claude responded, Helen Marchetti called at 2:52 in the afternoon, 3 days after we buried her sister, my wife of 41 years, in the sandy soil behind street. Helen Marchetti called at 2:52 in the afternoon, 3 days after we buried her sister, my wife of 41 years, in the sandy soil behind street. Augustine's outside Charleston, South Carolina, and she said, Walter, I talked to the lawyer this morning, and I need you to sit down before I tell you what I found out. I was standing in the garage, which is where I had been standing for most of those 3 days, because the garage was the one room in the house that did not have casseroles in it. I said, I'm sitting. I was not sitting. She said, Renee changed the trust. 6 weeks before she died. Danny is out of it completely. He gets the truck and nothing else. There was a pause, the specific pause of a woman bracing for a man to come apart on the other end of a phone line. She said, Walter, I don't know what happened. I don't know if Renee wasn't thinking clearly at the end. But I want you to know, I am going to help you fight this. We can get a lawyer. We can. I said, Helen. She stopped talking. I said, I know about the trust. The pause that followed was longer than the first one. She said, You know? I said, I know because I sat with your sister in that hospital room 3 weeks before she died, and she asked me one question, and I gave her one answer. And the trust is what came out of that conversation. Helen didn't say anything for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing change, the sound of a person rebuilding a conversation from different materials than the ones she'd walked in carrying. She said, finally, What did you tell her, Walter? I said, Come by the house Saturday. I'll make coffee. I'll tell you everything, start to finish, and you can decide for yourself what you think of me after you hear it. She said, I have time now. I said, I don't. Not for this. This one needs the whole story or none of it. She came Saturday. I told her everything. This is that story. My name is Walter Prentice. I am 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a marine surveyor working the port in Charleston, which is a job most people have never heard of, and which consists, at its core, of one skill: looking at a vessel that appears fine on the surface and finding the place where the hull has been quietly failing for longer than anyone wanted to admit. You learn to read the waterline. You learn that the damage that sinks a ship is almost never the damage anybody can see standing on the dock. My wife Renee died on a Thursday in September after 11 months of pancreatic cancer. And I want you to understand, before I tell you what my son Daniel did, that everything I am about to describe was not something I decided in grief or in anger. It was something I watched happen in daylight, over the better part of a year, with the same slow attention I had given 1,000 hull inspections, and I wrote it down the way I had always written things down, plainly, without embellishment, because the plain version is the only version that holds up when somebody eventually asks you to prove it. If you've ever sat across a kitchen table from your own child and realized you were looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face, you already know most of what this story is about. Stick around, because I'm going to tell you the rest of it, and I'm going to tell you what Renee said to me 3 weeks before she died that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. Renee Ann Prentice, born Renee Ann Marchetti in Beaufort, South Carolina, was a labor and delivery nurse for 32 years at Roper Hospital downtown, and she brought to that work a particular gift, which was the ability to stay calm in a room where everyone else had lost the ability to. She was not a woman who raised her voice, not because she lacked strong feelings, but because she had learned early in her career that a raised voice in a delivery room accomplishes nothing except making the crisis worse. She carried that same steadiness into our marriage and into raising our 2 children, and if you had asked anyone in Mount Pleasant to describe Renee Prentice, they would have used the word steady before they used any other word. She was not soft, though. I need to be precise about that, because the softness is not the part of her that matters to this story. She had grown up the daughter of a shrimp boat captain who did not tolerate excuses, and there was a bedrock quality to her that people mistook for gentleness because she delivered it gently, but it was not gentleness underneath. It was judgment, clear and settled, and once Renee had made a judgment about a person, she did not often revise it. We had 2 children. Our daughter Michelle was 42, lived 40 minutes away in Somerville with her husband and their 3 kids, and taught middle school science. She had her mother's steadiness and her mother's judgment, and in the 11 months of Renee's illness, Michelle had rearranged her entire life around her mother's treatment schedule without once being asked to. She drove Renee to chemotherapy every other Tuesday. She sat through the long afternoons at MUSC when the infusions ran 4 and 5 hours. She never once, in 11 months, asked a single question about what would happen to the house, the boat, the retirement accounts, or anything else. Not once. I want to be honest that I noticed this the way you notice something is missing from a room before you can name what it is. Our son Daniel was 39, lived in North Charleston, worked as a regional manager for a company that leased commercial HVAC equipment. And he had, over the years, developed a fluency in numbers and valuations that I had underestimated the significance of until it was too late to underestimate it any further. He was not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly, the same way I would want it said about me if our positions were reversed, because this is not a story about a villain twirling a mustache. It is a story about a man who had organized his understanding of his family around a set of assumptions, and who, when those assumptions were threatened by his mother's mortality, revealed the shape of those assumptions in 100 small ways that added up to something he probably could not have named himself, not even now. The diagnosis came in October of the previous year, after Renee had been having stomach trouble she'd attributed to stress and turned out to be something else entirely. The oncologist at MUSC was direct with us in the way good oncologists learn to be direct, because false comfort costs people time they don't have to waste. Stage 3. Aggressive treatment plan. A timeline the doctor would not commit to, beyond saying that some patients responded well and some did not, and that Renee's overall health gave her a fighting chance. Renee received this the way she received everything difficult in her life, which was with a single day of silence, and then a decision about what she intended to do with the time she had. She told the children in November. Michelle drove over that same weekend and stayed 2 nights and cried in the bathroom where she thought no one could hear her, and then came out and made dinner and asked what needed doing around the house. That was Michelle. Daniel came for Sunday dinner, expressed the appropriate grief, hugged his mother for a long time at the door, and drove back to North Charleston. Over the following weeks, his calls increased in frequency. Not daily, but noticeably more than before, and warm in a specific way, the particular warmth of a man who has decided warmth is the correct posture for the moment and is applying it with intention rather than letting it arise on its own. He began visiting more often too, and he began bringing things, small, useful items, groceries, a space heater for the sunroom where Renee liked to sit, and each time he brought something, he made certain that both of us saw him bring it. I noted the change. I did not draw a conclusion from it, not yet, because 31 years of hull inspections had taught me that a single reading tells you nothing. You need a pattern before you know what you're looking at. What established the pattern was a Sunday afternoon in December, 2 months after the diagnosis, when Daniel stayed behind after dinner while Renee rested upstairs and asked to speak with me alone in the den. He said he had been thinking, given everything going on, about whether Renee and I had our affairs in order. He said he didn't want to be morbid about it. He said he just wanted to make sure that if anything happened, there wouldn't be confusion or complication for the family, and wasn't it smart to think about these things while everyone could still discuss them clearly. I told him we had an estate attorney and everything was arranged, and I thanked him for his concern. He said, "Of course," and something else warm that I don't remember exactly, and we rejoined the rest of the evening. That night, after he'd left, I went down to the workshop behind the garage where I keep my tools and my old surveyor's logbooks, and I took out a fresh one, and I wrote down the date and what he had said, as close to word for word as I could manage, the same way I would log a stress fracture on a steel plate. I did not tell Renee. I did not yet know what I was building, and I did not want to hand her a suspicion on top of everything else she was carrying. The log grew through the winter. In January, in a conversation about whether my surveyor's pension had been rolled into any kind of trust, Daniel mentioned that a coworker had gone through something similar with his own father's estate and run into complications, and he just wanted to make sure we'd avoided the same pitfalls. In February, he asked Renee directly, not me, about the lake house up near Santee that had been in my family since 1971, a modest place on the water where our grandchildren had learned to fish and swim, every summer of their lives. He framed the question as concern for family harmony, as not wanting there to be conflict after she was gone, as simply wanting to honor whatever she wished while she was still able to say it clearly. Renee told me about that conversation the same night, sitting across from me at our kitchen table with the same expression she'd worn across 4 decades of kitchen tables. And she said, "Daniel asked me about the lake house today." I said, "I know he did." She said, "You've noticed him asking about things." I said, "Since December." She went quiet, and then she said, "I've been watching it longer than that." That was the evening the two of us named it out loud for the first time, sitting together at that table, with the late winter light coming through the window over the sink, and we talked honestly about what we had each separately been observing and what we thought it meant. Renee said, "I believe he loves me, Walter. I want to be fair about that. But what he's doing isn't coming from love right now. It's coming from the part of him that has always measured his relationships by what they might eventually provide, and he can feel a deadline approaching, and it's changed his behavior, whether he'd admit that to himself or not." She said this without any bitterness in her voice at all, which was very much like her. She named hard things plainly and did not need drama to make them true. I asked her what she wanted to do about it. She said she wanted time to think, and she wanted me to keep watching. I kept watching. I kept the log. Spring turned into summer, and Renee's treatment produced good weeks and hard weeks in roughly equal measure. And through all of it, Daniel's attention stayed elevated and stayed pointed, in one way or another, toward the question of what his mother had and what might happen to it eventually. In July, 7 months after the diagnosis, I found something that moved what I was tracking from suspicion into documentation. Renee's oncology practice used a patient portal for test results and visit summaries, and the portal kept a login history, which I had started checking periodically that spring after a hospital system in Colombia had been in the news for a data breach. I found that the portal had been accessed 9 times over a 2-month stretch from a device that was not Renee's laptop and not her phone. I pulled the login records, noted the times, and ran the associated IP information through a basic lookup, the kind anyone can do with a browser, in about 5 minutes. It traced to a residential internet provider serving North Charleston. I sat on that finding for nearly 3 weeks before I did anything with it, and I want to explain why, because those 3 weeks were not idleness, they were verification. A surveyor who reports a hull failure on the strength of one reading, without eliminating every other explanation first, is not doing his job. He's guessing, and guessing gets people hurt. So I checked whether Renee had ever logged into the portal from anywhere other than her own devices. She hadn't. I checked whether the hospital system had any known glitch that could make a login appear to originate somewhere it hadn't. It didn't. I checked, against the calendar Renee kept on the refrigerator and against my own memory of Daniel's visits, whether he had been at our house using our home network on any of the 9 dates in question. He had not been at our house on a single one of those 9 dates. The finding held up. My son had been reading his dying mother's oncology records, including her most recent scans and her most recent prognosis notes, 9 separate times over 2 months, without her knowledge and without her permission. What he did with what he learned came out later. In the phone records, Renee's attorney subpoenaed after the trust was amended, as part of the documentation her attorney wanted on file in case anything was ever challenged. Those records showed 11 calls between Daniel and a contact saved in his phone as R. Delacroix, CFP, over roughly the same window as the portal access, with call lengths running anywhere from 9 minutes to just over half an hour. The attorney's investigator identified this Delacroix as a certified financial planner working out of an office in Mount Pleasant who specialized in trust structuring and inheritance planning. My son had been consulting a financial planner about his expected inheritance while secretly reading his dying mother's most private medical records to gauge, I have to assume, how much time he had left to plan around. Those 2 facts sitting next to each other in the record were the facts that turned what Renee eventually decided from something painful into something she considered simply necessary. The conversation between Renee and her attorney, a careful, gray-haired woman named Sandra Kessler, who had handled our family's legal matters for almost 20 years, took place in our living room on a Tuesday afternoon in August. Renee sat in the recliner by the window where she'd taken to spending most of her afternoons by then, and I sat on the couch, and Sandra sat across from us with a folder of papers on her lap. Renee told her the whole thing, the visits, the questions about the lake house, the portal access, the calls to the financial planner. Sandra listened without interrupting, the way a good professional does, and when Renee finished, Sandra asked 2 questions to clarify a few details, and then was quiet for a moment, before she said, "Renee, I want to ask you plainly, what outcome do you actually want, not what you think you're supposed to want?" Renee said, "I want to know that what Walter and I built together over 41 years goes where the two of us decide it should go, and not where Daniel has spent the last several months, quietly positioning himself to receive it." Sandra said, "Then, let's talk about what you're able to do." She laid out the options, all of them straightforward and entirely legal for a woman making decisions about her own estate while of sound and documented mind, which Renee unmistakably was. At the end of it, Renee turned and looked at me with the look she'd been giving me across 41 years of hard conversations, and she said, "Walter, what do you think I should do?" I said, "I think you already know what's right, and I think you should do it." She said, "I need to hear you say it plainly, because this changes what your son inherits completely, and I need to know you're standing next to me on it, not just letting me carry it." I said, "Renee, I am asking you to do this. Not just agreeing to it, asking." That was the conversation. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, my wife died in that same recliner by the window, with Michelle holding one of her hands and my hand holding the other. Daniel was at the house within the hour, and at the funeral 3 days later, he moved through the reception with the same practiced warmth he'd been carrying all year, accepting condolences, saying the right things, looking, in every visible way, like a grieving son. He told me twice that afternoon that he was going to be there for me, through whatever came next, that we would get through this as a family. I told him I appreciated that. I looked at his face while he said it, and I thought about the 9 logins and the 11 calls to a man named Delacroix and the Sunday in December when he'd asked about our affairs in the language of practical concern, and I thought about Renee's hand in mine that last Tuesday morning with the light coming through the window she'd always loved. He said he wanted to come by the next day to talk about, in his words, how things were going to work going forward. I told him that was fine. I told him to come at 10. He arrived at 10 sharp, sat at our kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, which I noted, and the composed, gentle expression of a man who has rehearsed a difficult conversation in his car before walking in. He said he wanted to start by saying how much he'd loved his mother. He said he wanted to handle everything with the respect she deserved. He said he'd been thinking hard about what she would have wanted, and he wanted to make sure whatever happened with the estate honored that. I let him finish. Then I said, "Daniel, Sandra Kessler is the trustee. Anything about the estate goes through her office." He said, "Of course, absolutely. I just wanted to get a sense of, what we're actually working with here, what Mom decided." I said, "Sandra will walk you through exactly what your mother decided." He called Sandra's office at 11:30. I know this because Sandra called me at noon to let me know he'd called, and that the conversation had gone, in her words, about how you'd expect, which was her professional way of telling me the news had landed, the way news like that lands on a person who had been quietly planning around a different outcome. He called me himself 20 minutes later. He didn't use the warm voice this time. He used the other one, the one underneath it, the one that comes out once a man realizes no one else is in the room to hear it. He said, "Dad, what happened to the trust?" I said, "You'll need to talk to Sandra about the specifics." He said, "Sandra already told me. She said Mom amended it 6 weeks before she died, and I'm not in it. I get the truck. That's it." I said, "I know." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I asked her to do it." The silence on his end of the line went on longer than the one with Helen had. He said, "You asked her. You asked your dying wife to cut your own son out." I said, "I sat with your mother 3 weeks before she died, and we talked plainly about what we both already knew and what we both wanted. The decision was hers, entirely hers. The asking was mine. Both of those things are true at once." He said, "What exactly do you think you know?" I said, "Daniel, I know about the portal 9 times over 2 months, reading your mother's scans and her prognosis without her permission. I know about the calls to Delacroix, the financial planner, 11 of them, over that same stretch. I know about December, when you asked me about our affairs at that kitchen table, like you were just being thoughtful. I know about February, when you asked your mother about the lake house instead of asking me. I've known most of it since December, and I wrote it down as I learned it, and your mother knew nearly all of it before I ever told her the rest." The quiet that followed that was a different kind of quiet than before. Not a man revising his story. A man recognizing he'd already lost the argument he hadn't known he was having. He said, "She knew." I said, "She knew, and she made her decision with complete knowledge of everything she knew. I'm not going to tell you how to feel about her decision. You can think about it however you need to. What I need you to understand is that it was hers, made clearly, with a lawyer she trusted for 20 years, while she was fully herself, right up until the last week. Sandra can confirm every part of that. The notary who witnessed the signing can confirm it. There is no version of this where anyone can credibly say your mother didn't know exactly what she was doing. He said, "I'm going to fight it." I said, "That's your right, and Sandra can walk you through exactly what fighting it would look like, and what it would find." He didn't answer right away. I could hear him thinking on the other end of the line, the particular silence of a man doing math he doesn't like the answer to. Then he said, "Dad, did you think at all about what this does to us?" I said, "Daniel, I thought at length about what your behavior over the last 11 months did to your relationship with your mother. I thought about it very carefully, and I thought about what she would choose to do once she understood the full shape of it. The trust reflects what she chose, not what I chose. What she chose." He hung up without saying anything else. I set the phone down on the table and looked at the recliner by the window, empty now, the morning light falling across it the way it always had. The way Renee used to say was the reason she fell in love with that room the first time we walked through this house back in 1989. She'd been right about the light. She'd been right about most things. Michelle came downstairs a little after that, still staying in her old room since the funeral, and she sat down across from me, the way her mother used to sit, and she said, "He called?" I said, "He called." She said, "How'd it go?" I said, "The way it needed to." She was quiet a moment, then she said, "Mom always knew what she was doing." I said, "Right up to the very end. That was your mother." She put her hand flat on the table, not reaching for mine, just there, the way people sometimes make themselves present without asking anything of it. We sat like that a while, the morning light coming through, the casseroles still crowding the counters, the particular quiet of a house that has just carried something enormous and is trying to remember how to be ordinary. Daniel never did contest the trust. Sandra had been right that the documentation was airtight, and whoever he'd consulted about his odds gave him, I have to assume, the same discouraging math in different words. He called me in November, not about the estate. He called because it was getting close to the holidays, and because, I think, the months since September had produced in him some quiet accounting of his own, not exactly remorse, but something adjacent to it, an understanding of what had been visible to us all along and what that visibility had ultimately cost him. He didn't apologize for the portal, and he didn't bring up Delacroix. What he said was that he'd been in a hard place for a long time and hadn't always acted like the man he wanted to be during it. He said he understood now that his mother had seen far more than he'd given her credit for seeing. I told him, "She saw everything, Daniel. She always did. She just decided on her own timeline when to act on what she saw." He asked if she'd been angry with him. I said, "No, she wasn't angry. That wasn't in her, not toward the people she loved. She was sad. Sad about what she'd had to see, and sad about the choice it left her with. But she made that choice clearly and without any anger in it at all. That was the most her thing she ever did." He was quiet a while, and then he said he wanted to come by after the holidays if that was all right. I told him the door had never been closed. I told him what had changed was the arrangement, not the relationship, and that those were two different things, and he needed to understand the difference if he wanted to walk back through that door, honestly. Helen came for coffee that Saturday, exactly as I'd told her she would. I told her everything: the logbook, the portal access, the calls to the financial planner, the conversation in the living room with Sandra, every word Renee had said to me at that kitchen table. Helen listened the way her sister used to listen, all the way through, without a single interruption, and when I finished, she sat with her cup for a long moment, looking at the recliner by the window. She said, "She would have told me eventually." I said, "She would have. She had her own timing for things. Always did." Helen said, "She asked you to ask her." "That's what I'm hearing," I said. She'd already decided. She just needed to hear that I stood beside the decision, that it was ours together and not hers to carry alone. That was Renee. She never wanted to hold the hard things by herself. Helen looked back at the window, where the light was doing exactly what it always did in that room, and she said, quietly, "She found the right man, didn't she?" I said, "She found the right kitchen window," is what she always told me. Said that was what sold her on this house in the first place. Helen smiled, and there was enough of her sister in that smile that I had to look away for a second and find the window myself. The trust says what it says. The lake house is still ours, still full of grandchildren every summer. The logbooks, mine and Sandra's files both, sit in the cabinet in my workshop, in the order they've always been in. Michelle has copies of everything, in case anyone ever asks. 41 years is a long time to know a person. It's long enough to know, without needing to be told, exactly when a decision has to be made and how to sit beside somebody in a chair by a window and help them find the courage to make it. Long enough to know that asking isn't the betrayal. The betrayal was 9 logins into a dying woman's private medical file, and 11 calls to a stranger about money that wasn't his yet, and a Sunday afternoon in December dressed up as concern. The trust wasn't punishment. It was the correction. Renee signed it herself, with her own hand, knowing exactly what she was signing, and she died 3 weeks later at peace, with her daughter holding one hand and mine holding the other, to the light coming through the window she picked out in 1989 because of exactly this. The morning light, just like this, every single day since. Claude responded, "Real love isn't the loud kind that shows up with casseroles and warm phone calls. It's the quiet kind that notices, that keeps watch, that tells the truth, Eve. Real love isn't the loud kind that shows up with casseroles and warm phone calls. It's the quiet kind that notices, that keeps watch, that tells the truth, even when the truth is heavy." Renee didn't act out of anger. She acted out of clarity, and that clarity protected what mattered most. So love the people close to you honestly, not just conveniently, because attention, given consistently, is the truest inheritance anyone can leave behind. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to leave you with a genuine, positive life lesson.